Well, first of all, thank you so much for sitting down with us. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely happy to do it.
I'm going to start by talking about an event that's happening next week, which is the UN General Assembly. Can you just walk us through what the President's goals are for the UN General Assembly, especially with regards to further isolating Russia?
I think what you're going to see from the President is a focus on demonstrating the degree to which United States leadership on the world stage is back and revitalized. He'll have a chance to address the whole General Assembly in the morning. He'll be dealing with issues of food security around the globe. Food security, which is exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, clearly. And he'll have a chance to talk about the Global Defense Investment Initiative and some of the efforts that the United States is helping lead in terms of providing alternate sources of investment funds for countries, particularly low and middle income countries, that are trying to improve their own infrastructure at home or their own healthcare at home, and to help lift them up as well.
Can I ask you to just talk about some of the energy security goals that the U.S. is bringing to the UNGA this year?
I think the President has been very focused on energy security now since his time in office. And as you know, energy security as well has been put at risk by what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine. He's literally weaponizing energy. The President stood up a task force earlier this year to try to look for ways to improve the stores of natural gas in Europe to get more LNG to the continent. We've done that. The U.S. alone has doubled our commitments, the commitments he made back in March, and we're working with other allies and partners and the industry to see what else can be done because winter's coming. So I think, again, the UN General Assembly offers the President an opportunity to highlight all the work that the United States has done on these fronts.
Is there anything else you want to add on the UN before I move on to the next thing? Brilliant. So let's talk about the conflict in Ukraine. Big topic of discussion here. I have a few questions. So first of all, does the administration believe that Russia has switched its tactics towards targeting civilians or civilian infrastructure, as we've seen in recent days? And if so, are there going to be consequences to that? Does the U.S. plan to respond to hold Russia accountable?
Sadly, we have seen almost from the beginning of this war, now going on 7 months, that the Russian soldiers, Russian leadership has not only approved of, but participated in atrocities against the civilian population of Ukraine. Everything from airstrikes on hospitals to actual on-the-ground war crimes against the men and women and their children in Ukraine. And the United States is involved with the international community in making sure that these instances are being documented and that they are available to appropriate international investigators so that Russia can be held accountable. And that's our expectation going forward. But the brutality that Mr. Putin has visited upon Ukraine and Ukrainians has been there almost since the very beginning. I think you're referring to some recent airstrikes that he has conducted with respect to civilian infrastructure. It's of a piece of his utter disregard for civilian casualties and his contempt for the very culture of Ukraine. Now, he's hitting these infrastructure targets, we think, because he's lashing out at the counteroffensive that the Ukrainians have been conducting, particularly in the north, and he's basically trying to punish the Ukrainian people for the work of their soldiers on the battlefield.
Let's move on to the initial goal of this conflict. I think it was Secretary Blinken who said this was to strengthen Ukraine's hand on the battlefield, or strengthens Ukraine's hand at the negotiating table, rather.
Right.
That seems to have happened with these recent string of victories. So does the administration believe that now is the time to pressure President Zelensky to get to the negotiating table? And is he ready?
We believe it's up to President Zelensky to determine if and when he's ready to sit down at the negotiating table. And he has said himself that he's not in a position to move that forward right now. We respect that. He's the commander-in-chief. He's the president of Ukraine. He gets to decide how success is going to be defined and how he's going to work towards a diplomatic end to this war. I would also note that Mr. Putin has also made it very clear that he's not interested in stopping the fighting. And here's the thing. I mean, obviously we want to see this war end. And clearly a diplomatic solution would be a preferred option. But a much more preferred option would be for Mr. Putin to just stop it today. He doesn't need to be in Ukraine, never needed to be in Ukraine from the get-go. So he could end this war today, absent negotiations, by just pulling his troops out and stopping the violence on the Ukrainian people. And we can't forget that. So again, we're going to continue to support President Zelensky, as President Biden has said, for as long as it takes. We're going to make sure that, to Secretary Blinken's words, not only can he succeed at the negotiating table, if and when it comes to that, but that he can succeed on the battlefield today, because Vladimir Putin is still prosecuting this war against Ukraine today.
I want to talk a little bit about the debate over the SST, the State Sponsor of Terror designation. And earlier, Ned Price said that the administration, while they've decided against it, is going to apply sanctions and tools that are analogous to an SST. What does that mean? What tools do we have other than, existing sanctions and export controls?
So what we're talking about here is looking for and working with Congress to look for additional measures of holding Russia and Mr. Putin accountable for what they're doing in Ukraine. There have been very effective, very stringent sanctions and export controls already put in place by the United States alone, let alone our European colleagues, on Mr. Putin. And we're going to continue to look for additional ways to hold him accountable and to increase the costs and consequences for this war. We don't believe that a state sponsor of terrorism designation is the most effective way to do that. And there's a couple of reasons for that. We talked to humanitarian groups, and they would be concerned, they have expressed concerns, that with such a designation, it might make it harder for them to work with vendors inside Ukraine to get humanitarian assistance to the men and women there who desperately need it. Millions have been displaced inside Ukraine. The food security deal could also come under risk. We've now been able to get, because of this food security grain deal out of the Black Sea, more than 2.5 million tons of grain has left Ukraine. That's significant, and we want to keep that flow going. And if we designate Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, it's possible that that grain deal could be put in jeopardy. And I think back to your earlier questions about food security, we can all understand why that would not be a good thing. And then lastly, back to what we just talked about the negotiating table. We want to make sure that Mr. Zelensky has enough flexibility, not only the leverage, but flexibility when he sits down at the negotiating table. That designation could, in fact, reduce his flexibility to come up with a negotiated solution. So again, we don't believe that this is the most appropriate path forward, but we're also willing, as my colleague at the State Department said, we're also willing to work very closely with Congress on additional and other measures.
I'm just going to ask you very quickly if you can just give us a précis of the new aid package which was approved last night. Anything new or different, interesting that you want to point out? What's the strategy?
I think what you'll see in this package, what you are seeing, is it's very consistent with most of the recent packages here since the Russians have really focused on the Donbass and down in the south. And so you're seeing more ammunition for the HIMARS system, the advanced rocket system. You're seeing more artillery rounds. You're seeing small arms and ammunition and other items that we know the Ukrainians are literally using every day in this fight, in their counteroffensive, and we want to make sure that they get more of them.
We're going to move on to the meeting yesterday between the Chinese and Russian presidents. Yeah. So we heard Karine Jean-Pierre, the press secretary, say that the administration has made clear its concerns over these closer ties between Russia and China. But do you believe that this new alignment or this closer alignment is tactical or strategic? I mean, do you think that these guys are in it for the long term? And we also heard Putin say that China expressed its concerns and questions over the conflict in Ukraine. And I just wonder how the U.S. is going to leverage that.
Well, I think it's been no secret that President Putin and President Xi have been forging a closer relationship. That's not new. It's not really surprising either, because both leaders of those two countries have expressed their annoyance and their dislike of American leadership around the world and the rules-based international order that not only the United States, but so many other countries around the world espouse and try to improve. And this they find, in many ways, they find inimical to what they believe are their own selfish interests. So it's not surprising that these two leaders would be continuing this relationship. I think it's noteworthy, though, to your other point in your question, that Mr. Putin recognized publicly that China had expressed concerns. We have not seen, we don't believe that this is the time for business as usual with Russia by anybody. It's not the time to be buying their oil at these exorbitant prices. It's not the time, certainly, to be violating the sanctions regime. We have not seen the Chinese provide any material support to Mr. Putin for the war in Ukraine. And we haven't had any indications that they are violating sanctions. So it is noteworthy that Mr. Putin would mention that China had some concerns. China's got choices to make. As we've said many times before, we would clearly prefer that the choice they make is to condemn what Mr. Putin is doing in Ukraine, as so many other countries around the world has done, and make clear these concerns that they apparently have about what he's doing there.
How are you going to leverage that, though? Because there is a disagreement between these two big powers. How's the U.S. going to work that diplomatically, or what tools are you going to bring to bear?
We're going to keep doing what we've been doing to support Ukraine and to hold Mr. Putin accountable. And we're going to continue to keep the lines of communication open with Beijing, as we must. There are issues of disagreement, clearly, between the United States and China. But there's also areas where we have said we can and we should cooperate on, such as climate change, such as the opioid crisis, such as counterterrorism. And it's regrettable that the Chinese have shut down now some of those avenues for us to have a discussion, particularly about opioids, fentanyl, and, of course, climate change. That's regrettable, but we're going to look for ways to continue to make sure we can keep those lines of communication open. I think it's also important to note that these two countries are not like best of friends. I mean, they have a relationship, obviously, but it is not built on a whole heck of a lot of mutual trust and confidence. And it's really more of a partnership of convenience than it is anything akin to the kinds of alliances and partnerships that the United States has around the world.
Interesting. Okay, let's move on. We're in the home stretch, John. We're going to talk about the Jcpoa, the Iran deal. So we've heard European members of Parliament of the negotiating team express pessimism that there's going to be a deal reached before the U.S. midterms. And meanwhile, the IAEA says that there's been 130 kilos of enriched uranium added to Iran's supplies. So how optimistic is the administration that a deal can be reached? And do you have any timelines or any predictions for that?
I couldn't give you a prediction, and I wouldn't begin to speculate on that. I would just tell you a couple of things. The president has been very clear that we're not going to allow Iran to achieve a nuclear weapons capability, because he knows that no problem in the Middle East gets easier to solve with a nuclear-armed Iran. Now, the president has also said that he believes the best way to achieve that outcome is through a diplomatic process. And we have been involved in back and forth negotiations now for 16 months, trying to get the Jcpoa re-implemented, get everybody back into that deal from 2015. We have done some back and forth recently, and as you heard Secretary Blinken say, we are actually farther apart now than we were, or we thought we were, even just a few weeks ago. And as the Secretary said, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to get this implementation, get us back into the deal anytime real soon. But that doesn't mean that we've given up on the effort. It doesn't mean that it's all abandoned. So while I couldn't give you a prediction of if or when, what I can tell you for sure is that the United States is still committed to getting back into the Jcpoa, getting it back implemented, because again, we believe the deal was working before the previous administration pulled out. And you don't have to look any further, and your question actually teed it up perfectly, that Iran is closer now to breakout capability now, today, as you and I sit here, than they were anywhere near when the deal was put in place back in 2015.
Final question about the Queen. Any national security implications to her death and the hold that she had over the 56 English-speaking countries in the Commonwealth?
Obviously, we, as the President said, we send our deepest condolences to not only the royal family, but to all the people of Great Britain. The Queen was such an icon, and her compassion and her stewardship and her grace
But her leadership of these 56 like-minded countries.
And her leadership
Are you
was
concerned
so
about-
critical. But we are confident that with King Charles and with Prime Minister Truss, that the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain will endure. We're not worried about that at all.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.